Most Kentucky Derby winners spend the week before the race trying to avoid bad news, a minor injury, a poor workout, a difficult draw, anything that might hurt their chances. The last thing any owner wants is for people to start questioning whether their horse can win. But in the spring of 1940, one Kentucky Derby contender faced a very unusual problem. People thought he was dead, not injured, not sick, dead. Newspapers reported it. Rumors spread, racing fans believed it, and for a short time, one of the horses expected to compete in America's biggest race was being discussed as if he had already disappeared from the sport forever. There was just one problem. The horse wasn't dead. He was very much alive. In fact, a few days later, he would do something even more unbelievable. He would win the Kentucky Derby. It's the kind of story that sounds made up. The kind of story that would probably be rejected by a movie producer for being too unrealistic. Yet it actually happened. And today, most racing fans have never heard it, partly because the horse involved never became one of the all-time legends. He wasn't Secretariat. He wasn't Man o' War. He wasn't Citation or Seattle Slew. His name was Gallahadion, and while his Derby victory became part of racing history, the strange events that happened before it have slowly faded from memory. That's unfortunate, because if there is one thing horse racing has always produced, it's incredible stories. Not just great horses, stories. And Gallahadion's might be one of the strangest, because before he shocked Churchill Downs, before he ruined betting tickets across America, and before he became a Kentucky Derby winner, he somehow had to survive his own death. At least on paper. The funny thing is that Gallahadion wasn't supposed to be the star of the Derby that year. Not even close. When people looked at the 1940 field, their attention was focused elsewhere. There were bigger names, more accomplished horses, runners with stronger reputations. Gallahadion wasn't entering Churchill Downs as the horse everyone expected to beat. He was entering as an outsider, the kind of horse people often overlook, the kind of horse bettors glance at before moving on to somebody else. That's important because it explains why what happened next felt so shocking. If a favorite wins the Kentucky Derby, people remember the performance. If a long shot wins, people remember the surprise. And Gallahadion was definitely closer to the second category. Long before the Derby, his story had already been unusual. He was born in 1937 and came from a respected bloodline. His sire was Sir Galahad III, one of the most influential stallions in American racing history. That pedigree gave him credibility from the beginning. People knew he had potential. The question was whether potential would become results. As a young horse, Gallahadion showed flashes of ability. He wasn't hopeless. He wasn't a complete unknown, but he also wasn't dominating headlines. When racing fans talked about future superstars, his name usually wasn't the first one mentioned. That would become a theme throughout his career. Gallahadion had a habit of being underestimated again and again, until people suddenly realized he was better than they thought. By the time his 3-year-old season arrived, he had established himself as a capable horse, a talented horse, a horse worth paying attention to, but not necessarily a horse destined to win the Kentucky Derby. At least that's how most people saw it. And honestly, they had reasons. The Derby has always been a difficult race to predict. Every year, talented horses arrive carrying impressive records. Only one leaves with the roses. Sometimes the best horse wins. Sometimes racing gets complicated. Sometimes chaos takes over. And occasionally, a horse nobody expected changes everything. As Derby season approached, Gallahadion wasn't generating enormous excitement. The spotlight belonged elsewhere. The favorites attracted attention. The betting markets focused on other names. Newspapers spent more time discussing horses perceived to have stronger chances. Gallahadion existed in the background, present, respected, but far from the center of the story. Then came the rumor. Nobody knows exactly how every detail spread. Stories traveled differently in 1940. There was no internet, no social media, no instant fact-checking. Information moved through newspapers, radio reports, telephone calls, and conversations. That made mistakes much harder to correct. Once a false story gained momentum, it could take on a life of its own. And that's exactly what happened. Somehow, reports began circulating that Gallahadion had died, not retired, not scratched, dead. The story spread quickly enough that many people accepted it as fact. Think about how bizarre that must have been. Imagine opening a newspaper and reading that a Derby contender had died. You'd assume the story had been verified. You'd assume reporters had confirmed it. You'd assume nobody would print something so dramatic without checking. Yet somehow the mistake happened, and for a brief period, Gallahadion's racing career effectively ended in the public imagination. The horse was being mourned while standing perfectly healthy in his stable. Today, the story sounds almost impossible, but it serves as a reminder of how differently information moved during that era. Mistakes could become accepted truths, rumors could become headlines, and correcting those mistakes wasn't easy. By the time the truth emerged, the story had already spread. The horse wasn't dead, the reports were wrong, the Derby contender was alive, but the damage had already been done. People remembered the rumor, and now Gallahadion carried one of the strangest pieces of pre-race publicity any Kentucky Derby horse had ever experienced. Normally, horses enter the Derby trying to build momentum. Gallahadion entered trying to prove he existed. It's the sort of detail that feels funny now. But at the time, it must have been frustrating for everyone involved. Owners want attention focused on performance. Trainers want attention focused on preparation. Instead, people were talking about whether the horse had accidentally been declared dead. The whole situation felt absurd, yet in hindsight, it almost feels like foreshadowing, because Gallahadion's entire Derby story would become a lesson in assumptions. People assumed the reports were correct. They weren't. People assumed he wasn't a serious Derby contender. That wasn't correct either. The weeks leading into Churchill Downs continued as normal. Training continued. Preparation continued. The Derby field slowly took shape. And while Gallahadion remained something of an outsider, he wasn't without supporters. Every horse has believers. Every horse has people who see possibilities others miss. His connections understood that. They knew the horse's ability better than anyone. They had watched him train. They had watched him race. They knew he belonged in the field. The question wasn't whether Gallahadion deserved a chance. The question was whether he could take advantage of it. That's what makes the Kentucky Derby so fascinating. It's never just about talent. It's about timing. A horse can spend months preparing for one afternoon, one chance, one opportunity. And when the gates open, everything comes down to a few minutes. The pressure is enormous. Today, the Kentucky Derby attracts global attention. Millions watch. The event feels larger than life. Even in 1940, it occupied a special place in American sports. Winning the Derby changed careers, changed reputations, changed lives. Owners dreamed about it. Trainers dreamed about it. Jockeys dreamed about it. Some spent decades chasing the race. Many never won it. And now Gallahadion was preparing for that opportunity. A horse many people had already written off. A horse some people had literally declared dead. A horse entering Churchill Downs with very little expectation attached to his name. In some ways, that's a powerful position. Favorites carry pressure. Long shots carry freedom. Nobody expects perfection. Nobody demands greatness. They simply hope for a good performance. And that's exactly where Gallahadion found himself. Outside the spotlight, outside the headlines, outside most people's predictions. The favorites dominated discussion. The betting public looked elsewhere. Experts debated other horses. Meanwhile, Gallahadion quietly prepared. The irony is almost perfect. A few weeks earlier, people were discussing whether he was alive. Now he was preparing to compete in the most famous horse race in America. And the strangest part, the biggest surprise of his story hadn't happened yet. Because when Derby Day finally arrived, Gallahadion wasn't going to prove he was alive. He was going to prove that almost everyone had underestimated him. And before the afternoon was over, Churchill Downs would witness one of the most unexpected victories in Kentucky Derby history. Derby Day has a way of making every prediction feel fragile. For weeks, experts analyze horses. They compare records, study workouts, debate pedigrees, build convincing arguments about who will win. Then the gates open, and suddenly none of those opinions matter. Only the race matters. That's why the Kentucky Derby has always been dangerous for favorites. The race doesn't care about expectations. It doesn't care about headlines. And it certainly doesn't care about betting odds. Every year, horses arrive carrying different stories. Some are expected to become legends. Others are simply hoping for a chance. Gallahadion belonged firmly in the second group. As the crowd gathered at Churchill Downs on May 4th, 1940, very few people were looking at him as the future winner. He wasn't the horse generating excitement. He wasn't the horse attracting most of the money. And he definitely wasn't the horse dominating newspaper coverage. That attention belonged elsewhere, which was exactly why what happened next stunned so many people. The Kentucky Derby field that year contained several highly regarded runners. Many bettors felt confident they knew where the winner would come from. The logic seemed reasonable. The favorites had stronger reputations, better publicity, more support. Meanwhile, Gallahadion entered the race carrying little expectation. In horse racing, that's often a dangerous thing, because pressure can affect both horses and humans. A favorite feels the weight of expectation. A long shot can simply run. And when the starting gates finally open, Gallahadion did exactly that. He ran. The early stages of the race unfolded much the way many Derby races do. Horses fought for position, the field stretched out, jockeys searched for the perfect trip, the crowd reacted to every move. At first, there wasn't much reason for anyone to focus on Gallahadion. The race was still developing. The favorites still appeared to be in contention. Everything looked normal. But Kentucky Derby history is filled with moments that seem ordinary before suddenly becoming extraordinary. As the race continued, Gallahadion began improving his position, not dramatically, not with some spectacular burst that instantly captured attention. Instead, he steadily worked his way into the race. Closer, then closer still. The deeper the field moved into the Derby, the more it became clear that something unexpected was happening. The horses many people expected to dominate weren't taking control. The race was opening up. Opportunities were appearing. And Gallahadion was ready to take advantage. This is one of the reasons long shots sometimes succeed in the Derby. The race is demanding. The field is large. The pressure is enormous. Favorites aren't guaranteed anything. If they make mistakes, someone else can capitalize. And Gallahadion was positioning himself perfectly. As the horses approached the final stages of the race, spectators began noticing his challenge. The outsider was suddenly a serious threat. The horse most people had overlooked was moving into contention. The horse some people had mistakenly declared dead weeks earlier was very much alive. More alive than ever. Every stride carried him closer to the biggest victory of his life. The crowd could sense the possibility. The energy inside Churchill Downs began changing, because there is something uniquely exciting about an underdog. People love champions, but they also love surprises. And Gallahadion was becoming the surprise of the day. The stretch run finally arrived, the moment where Derby dreams are either realized or destroyed. Everything that happened before becomes irrelevant. Months of preparation, countless workouts, every previous race. It all comes down to a final drive toward the finish line. And Gallahadion responded brilliantly. The outsider surged forward. The opportunity was there. The opening was there. Now he simply had to finish the job. Horse racing often produces dramatic finishes. This wasn't one of those desperate photo finishes decided by inches. Gallahadion ran too well for that. As the wire approached, it became increasingly clear that the upset was real. The horse almost nobody expected to win was about to become a Kentucky Derby champion. Then he crossed the finish line. The race was over. Gallahadion had won the Kentucky Derby. Just like that, everything changed. The horse who entered the race as an outsider became part of racing history. The horse who had been mistakenly reported dead now stood at the center of one of the sport's biggest stages. The contrast was almost unbelievable. Only weeks earlier, false reports had convinced people his career was over. Now he was wearing the roses. That's one reason this story has endured for so long. Not because Gallahadion became one of the most dominant horses ever. Not because he transformed the sport. Because the story itself feels impossible. It's the kind of twist people remember. A horse incorrectly declared dead. Winning the Kentucky Derby sounds more like fiction than history. Yet it happened. And for Gallahadion's connections, the victory represented validation. They had believed in the horse when many others didn't. They had continued preparing while rumors spread. They had ignored assumptions and focused on the race itself. Their faith was rewarded. Meanwhile, bettors across America were left processing what they had just witnessed. That's another timeless part of the Kentucky Derby. No matter how much analysis exists beforehand, surprises remain possible. Sometimes the horse everyone overlooks becomes the horse nobody can catch. Gallahadion joined a long list of Derby winners who shattered expectations. The difference was that most of those winners weren't also fighting rumors about their own death. That detail made his victory unique. In the years that followed, Gallahadion's story slowly faded behind newer champions and newer headlines. That's normal in horse racing. Every generation produces fresh stars, fresh records, fresh moments. The sport keeps moving forward. Yet some stories deserve to be remembered, not because they involve the greatest horse, because they reveal something interesting about the sport itself. Gallahadion's story reminds us how unpredictable racing can be, how fragile assumptions can be, and how quickly narratives can collapse. One month people think a horse is dead. The next month, he's a Kentucky Derby winner. That's a dramatic swing, even by racing standards. It also highlights something that feels surprisingly modern: the danger of misinformation. Today, false stories can spread across social media. In 1940, they spread through newspapers and word of mouth. The technology changes. The problem remains remarkably similar. People hear something. People repeat it. Eventually, enough people believe it. The Gallahadion story is a reminder that mistakes in information didn't begin with the internet. They've always existed. The difference is that in this case, reality produced an ending nobody could have predicted. Instead of disappearing from racing, Gallahadion delivered the greatest performance of his career. And perhaps that's why the story remains so memorable. It's not really about a timing controversy. It's not about a legendary rivalry. It's not about an unbeatable champion. It's about a horse who refused to fit the story people had written for him. Everyone thought they knew who Gallahadion was. They thought they knew his chances. Some even thought they knew he was gone. Then the Kentucky Derby proved them wrong. One race changed everything. That's what makes the Derby special. Every year, horses arrive carrying labels: favorite, contender, long shot, pretender, future champion. No chance. The race doesn't care. The horses create their own stories. And on that spring afternoon in 1940, Gallahadion created one of the strangest stories the sport has ever seen. A story that began with a false obituary and ended with a blanket of roses. Even today, more than 80 years later, it remains one of the most unusual journeys ever completed at Churchill Downs. Because most Kentucky Derby winners spend race week hoping people notice them, Gallahadion spent part of it convincing people he was still alive. Then he won the biggest race in America. And that's why his victory remains one of the most unbelievable chapters in Kentucky Derby history. Not because he was supposed to win, not because anyone expected him to become a legend, but because sometimes reality produces stories too. Strange to invent. A horse mistakenly declared dead, a Kentucky Derby starting gate, a shocking upset, and a finish line that transformed one of racing's strangest rumors into one of racing's strangest triumphs. For Gallahadion, the lesson was simple. Reports of his death had been greatly exaggerated, and a few days later, he had the Kentucky Derby trophy to prove it.